We've just celebrated, is that better? Our 50th birthday. And you know, what better time to begin to think about our older neighborhoods here in Columbia? And what policies are needed? What tools to help keep them prosperous and attractive and economically vibrant? And while our series here focuses on Columbia, this particular session, I think, is equally applicable to older neighborhoods throughout the county. And we have wonderful, much better, we have wonderful neighborhoods here. Our older neighborhoods still have a good quality of life, and many of them are more affordable than newer areas. And we look forward, how can we make sure that they prosper as we move forward? Because, you know, there are other communities that have neighborhoods that are in decline. We don't have that, and we want to make sure that we don't. So we've invited our speakers, Paul Brophy and Mark Sisson, who I'll introduce in a bit, to discuss the best practices to address the community's aging housing stock and neighborhoods, and some ideas to sustain them. Before I introduce them, I'd like to invite Beverly White Seals, the CEO of the Community Foundation of Howard County. She is our co-sponsor, her organization, of this event, and she's going to talk to you about a new program that the foundation will help administer that's right on this topic. Beverly?
I was listening to Jane, and when she said Columbia's 50 years old and in our older neighborhoods, I got a little offended. 50's not that old. I happen to be probably the person with the greatest connection to Columbia in this room. I know our guest speakers each worked for the Enterprise Foundation. I worked for the Rouse Company, but I can beat any of you with my Columbia connections. My father was born in Columbia, South Carolina. I was born in the District of Columbia. I attended Columbia University School of Law. I moved to Columbia, Maryland, and I pay a Columbia Association assessment. Nobody can beat me with Columbia. But the Community Foundation of Howard County has always been interested in the livelihood and the vibrancy of our community. I guess it was about 3 or 3.5 years ago, Tom Carbo, who was director of the county's Office on Housing, started to look at a program in Baltimore called Healthy Neighborhoods, and began to appreciate the need to make sure we in Columbia were in the forefront of dealing with older neighborhoods so that they didn't go into decline. And thanks to Tom's vision, I started to stalk Mark Sisson. And I must have sat in Mark Sissman's office taking notes for hours and hours and hours to find out what it was that they were doing with their Healthy Neighborhoods program in Baltimore. And about 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, the county decided they were going to move forward with this Healthy Neighborhoods program, and they wanted a nonprofit partner, which is the Real Estate Charitable Foundation of Maryland, which is a supporting organization of the Community Foundation. There's some materials outside that will explain the program a little better, but basically it's going to be a mortgage loan program for single-family homes throughout Howard County. It's not targeted on any specific neighborhood. And the idea is to try and encourage new homeowners to move into those neighborhoods and upgrade them. People no longer want to buy a home with a little tiny kitchen and shag carpet on the floor. They're looking for granite countertops and an open floor plan. They don't want carports like they used to have. And so if we can encourage this revitalization of some of those older neighborhoods, we won't have to confront some of the deterioration in housing values. So the brochure out front will explain to you all the details of this program, and I'm hoping that we will get a lot of interest in the community. The bank program should be up and running sometime this winter, and we are encouraging individuals who are interested in homes that are 30 years or older with assessed values of up to $400,000 to get these lower interest loans without mortgage insurance, and you'll be able to, in fact, increase the amount of the loan to cover some both outside and inside renovations. And there are other initiatives that are going along with this project, but I think it's really a great first step for Howard County in making sure our older neighborhoods, those 50 years and less, don't decline. Thank you.
Thank you, and again, thank you for co-sponsoring this evening. I would like to acknowledge some people in the audience. Milton Matthews, President and CEO of Columbia Association. Milton? Thank you. Also, we have several members from the CA Board of Directors: Nancy McCord, Ginny Thomas, Andy Stack, Shari Zarrett, and Dick Bolton. Thank you. We have Val Lasens, Howard County Planning Director, and Deputy Planning Director Peter Conrad, and Amy Gowan. Also, I'd like to welcome Kelly Simino from the head of the Housing and Community Development Department at the county. So, you know, when I usually put these together with my colleagues, you know, a name comes out or two names come out, or somebody suggests something, and then, you know, I look all over the country and make sure they're good speakers and so forth. In this case, I had the topic and I had to find the speaker. And, you know, what is really great is I found two great speakers who are local to Maryland, local to Baltimore and Columbia, with deep roots in the community, and that's great, and I think that will be reflected in some of their comments today. Let me introduce them. Paul Brophy is our first speaker. He's principal with Brophy and Riley, Ellicott City-based consulting firm, specializing in economic development, neighborhood revitalization, and the management of complex urban redevelopment programs and projects. Prior to consulting, he served in city government, and also served, as Beverly said, the past president and co-CEO of the Enterprise Foundation, founded by James and Patty Rouse. Mr. Brophy has been a senior advisor to numerous organizations and universities, and he's currently on the faculty of Georgetown University. He's also an author, and he'll talk to you a little bit about his book, On the Edge, which just came out, America's Middle Neighborhoods, and a number of other books. Mark Sisson will follow, and he is currently president, as Beverly said, of Healthy Neighborhoods, a Baltimore community development nonprofit organized to improve selected neighborhoods through targeted programs and services. Prior to that, he was Baltimore's deputy housing commissioner, a banker, and also a key player in the redevelopment of the Hippodrome, which I think many of you have enjoyed, the $70 million world-class performing arts center. He also has served as past president of the Enterprise Foundation's Enterprise Social Investment Corporation. So we'll hear from Mr. Brophy first, and then Mr. Sisson, and then we will hear from you. So please welcome both of our speakers. First, Paul Brophy.
Jane, thank you very much. Thank all of you for being here. You know, I've been a consultant for a long time. This is very dangerous because I know from my consulting work that my opinion is worth more when it's distant. So being here at home, I hope you take my remarks as a homebody. I've been living in Columbia for 29 years. What a great place to live. And I've really enjoyed being a longtime resident of Columbia. And it was also a real life privilege for myself, and I know I speak for Mark, in working with Jim and Patty Rouse at the Enterprise Foundation. And both because that mission was so important to help people get housed well around the country, but also it gave us the opportunity to kind of hear some of the stories about the early days of Columbia. I wasn't here for those early days. I came in 1988, but it was really quite a remarkable kind of a set of insights that came from Jim as he got Columbia underway. So I want to talk about one of my favorite subjects, neighborhoods. And I often, when I'm teaching neighborhood revitalization, I'll say to my students, I want you to think about kind of the key measures of how would you measure how a neighborhood's getting better? How would you measure how a neighborhood's getting worse? And I get very good answers. I get sociological answers. I get kind of data answers, which are all very good and very helpful as planners. But I then say, I'm going to change this. I want you to go to a different part of your brain. Why have you chosen to live where you are living? And I get a wholly different set of answers. Kind of, well, I wanted a backyard. I wanted to be near the bar scene. I wanted to kind of be close to family. I wanted to be away from family. We all have our different preferences on where we want to live. And so I'm going to talk about kind of different aspects of neighborhoods. Next slide, please. And the first thing I want to kind of talk about is this thing that's really not that measurable, something I call the soul of a neighborhood, those less measurable dimensions. Then we're going to talk about the body, the physical dimensions, and so on, and also the financing, which I sometimes think of as the lifeblood of the neighborhood. But this notion of the soul of a neighborhood, first time I heard the expression, I was announcing in Pittsburgh kind of a major financing program kind of for neighborhood housing rehab in a neighborhood. And we were in an artist's studio. And the artist was there to basically host us, but not do anything else. She's in the back of the room. I finished the presentation. She stands up and says, that's all well and good, Brophy, but what are you doing for the soul of this neighborhood? And I realized as a government official, I couldn't do much at all about the soul of the neighborhood. The soul of the neighborhood is something that happens at the neighborhood level. Turns out I went back to that neighborhood last year and saw that the way the soul of that neighborhood evolved was very much about what that artist was bringing to the community, and lots of artists living in the neighborhood, and it had kind of a vibe of inventiveness and creativity and so on, which was the soul of this place. Well, Jim Rouse understood as he helped get Columbia underway that creating the souls of the villages, of the neighborhoods was very important. I remember him telling me about the women he hired early to start the first garden clubs and the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and those activities that we often take for granted, but the sociologists call social capital in neighborhoods. Kind of how well are we getting along? Do we know our neighbors? Do we care for each other? All of those aspects are things we take for granted often, things we need to focus on, we need to talk about, and things that really are what matter deep down about whether people decide to stay in a neighborhood, to invest in a neighborhood or not. And at that level, I'm going to step out of Columbia for a moment and think naturally. Next slide, please. We're in some trouble here in that the national data is telling us that the percentage of people who neighbor is really declining. You can see this figure that people in 2000, only 31% said they spent an evening a month socializing with a neighbor, down from 44% in 1998. Being neighborly, says Mark Duckelman in The Vanishing Neighbor, means leaving those around you in peace. He was a good neighbor, never bothered me, Well, that wasn't what Jim Rouse had in mind when he created Columbia. It wasn't the image that Columbians had as they came here. People came here because they wanted neighboring. They wanted, not only that, they wanted a diverse community, mixed income, mixed race, wanted a level of interaction. And we as Columbians are challenged by these national trends. We're all too busy. We're not neighboring as much as we used to do, I will bet. And certainly, for those of you who were early here, you typically saw this wonderful multimedia presentation on what Columbia was trying to be. And if you didn't want diversity, and you didn't want mixed income, you didn't move here. If you did, you moved here because, next slide please, you really wanted it. One back please. So here's Jim talking to the early Columbians. We are asserting that the next America, imagine this language, can be a land where outrageous differences can be managed peacefully, where people, poor and rich, Jew, Catholic, Protestant, black and white, liberal and conservative, can find richness and unity in diversity, where building a community together is a more demanding but rewarding task than recognizing division and separation, where hate is truly overcome by love. Excuse me for using this word, but this was Columbia's early brand, okay? This is why people came here. Now, I would guess, and those of you who buy or sell real estate in the room might be able to verify this or not, but most people who move to Columbia now think of Columbia as a better than average suburb. They're coming here because schools are good, crime is low, property values seem like they're going to rise. I doubt whether many people are coming for this reason. So the question is, from a soul perspective, what is the soul of the neighborhoods in Columbia going forward? And how do we continue to knit together people who are living together? How do we play a role? We meaning people in Columbia, we meaning the Columbia Association, we meaning maybe also Howard County. How do we play a role in seeing to it that people are able to get along well, neighbor well, even at a time when neighboring is down nationally, so that when people here come here, they are welcome and they welcome newcomers into the community, which has been the trademark of Columbia from day one. All right? So we're going to return to that at the very end of the presentation. I'm going to say some things about the physical, the financial, then to Mark to use the example of the wonderful work he and his colleagues have been doing in Baltimore to see how much of that applies to Columbia. Next slide, please. So Jane described this book that I edited a year ago called On the Edge, America's Middle Neighborhoods. And we're going to, I use the term middle neighborhoods. What are they? Let's go to the next slide, please. These are not the neighborhoods. They sometimes look like this, okay? Kind of older houses, need some upkeep. Next slide, please. Definition. These are the community areas that are, on the edge between growth and decline. And now this definition is written mostly for central cities. Okay? You can read this and think Baltimore. But you can also read this and think Columbia. All right? They're neighborhoods where the housing is typically affordable, where quality of life is sufficiently good that new home buyers are willing to play the odds and choose these neighborhoods over others in hopes that they will improve rather than decline. Now, the good news is that when thinking about Howard County or Columbia, we far more are typically thinking about neighborhoods that are going to improve over time. And by improve, I mean we're going to see housing values appreciate. We're going to see quality of life stay as good as it is or get better. We're seldom worried about decline. But Jane's invitation, I think, is to Mark and me is because there is some early worry about whether the older neighborhoods, the 50-year-old neighborhoods, are going to sustain themselves over time. And one of my colleagues, in describing kind of middle neighborhoods and why they're important, uses a public health analogy, which I think makes a lot of sense. We seem to have, to the degree that we have any neighborhood policy at all in this country, it's wait till the neighborhood gets very, very sick, and then we'll provide some remediation. Rather than, why not give these middle neighborhoods a vitamin, preventive medicine, to keep them from getting very sick, so that we're not dealing with deep levels of distress? And that's kind of the cusp question for some of the older neighborhoods we have in Columbia. What needs to be done to kind of help these neighborhoods stay healthy, get healthier, and to say it in a negative way, certainly prevent them from declining? Because they can decline. Because remember what I said about my students, and I will say to you, why do we choose neighborhoods? Remember that neighborhoods compete with each other for investment, for homeowners, for businesses, for landlords. And if you think about kind of the Baltimore region, all right, the neighborhoods that are losing in that competition are the Sandtown Winchesters in Baltimore, all right? Those neighborhoods that are full of vacancies because they are competing least well among others neighborhoods in the region. Now, obviously, Howard County is competing well, and I'll give you some data on that in a second. We can kind of look at that. But we should not take anything for granted in this regard, which is why we're here talking about these kind of neighborhoods tonight. Next slide, please. So housing is generally in acceptable condition. These neighborhoods nationally are mostly single family, but as I say, they are vulnerable to decline. Property values are sometimes flat. The value trajectory is not clear. So as Mark will say, one of the key measures they're using in Baltimore is, are housing values appreciating? Is it kind of what's happening in these neighborhoods? Next slide, please. I said some things about neighborhood change, neighborhoods compete. Next slide, please. And also kind of, I encourage us to be thoughtful about the fact that there are different kinds of neighborhoods. They play different roles, different functions. Most of the Columbia neighborhoods are neighborhoods that are oriented to families with children going to school. We're now going through a remake of our downtown in Columbia, trying to make that a neighborhood that is perhaps more aimed at people who don't have children. And when you think about the American household, fewer American households have children now than ever. We are an aging population, we are a single population, but we have very different categories of housing markets and different kinds of neighborhoods, and we need to think about the kind of neighborhoods we're dealing with in Columbia as we think about that typology. Next slide, please. So I did some brief analysis as to kind of how Columbia is doing. This is from a CA report that Jane pulled together, right? This is your work, Jane. It goes as far as 2010. I'm going to update this in a moment. But if I don't drive our filmmaker crazy, I'm going to move a little bit, okay? All right. I want to just kind of, so if you can't read it, this is Dorsey Hall, Harper's Choice, Hickory Ridge, Kings Contrivance, Long Reach, Oakland Mills, Owen Brown, River Hill, Town Center, Wild Lake, and then the average. First of all, you can see that there are considerable differences in prices. Howard County's average at the time was $437. You've got Long Reach at $291, Owen Brown $289, Kings Contrivance $298. These older neighborhoods, because of the housing stock, are generally kind of lower in price. Next slide, please. But if you look at kind of where things are now, this is 2007. This is data from this website called Zillow. And these are housing prices starting in 2011 through 2017. I'm going to show you this and then Fulton and Ellicott City just to give a sense of kind of how Columbia is doing by way of its northern neighbor and southern neighbor. Notice that the trend line is up, but for a little downtick here in 2017, nothing to worry about. All that's good news If you can't read that in the back, that top value is about $353,000, kind of median sale price. Next slide, please. This is Ellicott City. Housing prices are higher. Trend line is about the same, so that Columbia is not kind of falling back from Ellicott City. Next slide, please. Or Fulton, where the housing prices are much higher. Different housing stock, newer housing stock, and so on. Trend line is just about the same. Go 2 slides back, please. I want to go back to Columbia. You can see while the absolute housing price values are lower, Columbia is much more affordable than either Fulton or Ellicott City. Nonetheless, the point I want to emphasize is that the trend lines are all the same. Columbia is not declining in any way relative to these other places, which is really a piece of very good news for Columbia. So these neighborhoods are generally competing well, but at a lower market value, in part because the lower market value is a combination of the housing stock that Columbia has built and so on. Next slide, please. Keep going, thank you. Let me talk briefly about some challenges facing middle neighborhoods generically, because as we think about Columbia, we want to take these challenges into account, and then we'll go to Mark. Next slide, please. First, it's important to understand that if I'm talking middle neighborhoods, these neighborhoods that are kind of not the highest value, not the lowest value, we're talking about housing for people in the middle class. Well, the middle class is shrinking in this country. We're becoming bipolar. We're getting more people who are low income, more people who are high income, fewer people who are in the middle. And so, as a category of neighborhoods, middle neighborhoods are losing kind of the market that they've been going after simply because the middle class is shrinking. Next slide, please. It's also sorting differently. This happens to be data from St. Louis. If you look at what's happened, lower income tracts, middle income tracts, upper income tracts, 2000 and 2013, you can see that there's a growth in the lower income census tracts, a growth in the upper income census tracts, and a decline in the middle income census tracts, which is another indication that middle neighborhoods are threatened. Next slide, please. Another challenge, the aging housing stock is not meeting demand, hence the new program that Beverly described. How to modernize these kind of houses so that they are attractive in today's market. Again, neighborhoods are competing, housing competes, and a key element for middle neighborhoods is to get the housing stock improved so it can become more attractive to the current market preferences, and I'll say more about that at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So there's challenges, but there's some good work going on, and next slide, please. These are simply some logos of places in different cities, Poughkeepsie, Geneva, New York, where there's a level of conscious marketing going on of how to help these middle neighborhoods compete better by putting their best foot forward and helping these neighborhoods find the market, people who want to live in them, who want to improve the properties, and so on. And upper right-hand corner, Healthy Neighborhoods here in Baltimore is by far the best program in the country when it comes to working in these middle neighborhoods. We're having a national conference in Baltimore in about 2 weeks. Wanted to bring 50 or 60 people here who are working on this subject around the country, specifically so that they could see Mark's program. Mark, let's turn it to you, and then I'll come back with a few closing comments. Thank you.
I should say Jim and Patty Rouse would have been thrilled with how many of you are out thinking about the future of Columbia, its neighborhoods, and its strengths. The opportunity that Paul and I had to work for Jim and Patty was just remarkable. And Jim at the Rouse Company and Jim at Enterprise, had these big visions. Paul painted a couple of them now. And then he hired people like Paul and I who were really good, determined detail people. And he said, go do it. And so you're going to see in my presentation detail. How did we get from vision to getting things done? I have this aversion to consultants. No offense to my good friend Paul. I hate it in Baltimore when smart people come in and tell us what to do. This is not that. I want to share with you what we've learned in Baltimore over the last 10 or 15 years and hope that you will beg, borrow, and steal it and use it the way you want, because that's the right way to do this. So we had a problem in Baltimore. Our middle-income neighborhoods were fraying around the edges. People weren't fixing our properties. New people weren't moving in because they didn't see appreciation. And the public sector programs didn't speak to any of that because they were all very income targeted because we had great need. So what do you do about it? What do you do about that? This vision and the responses were not created in the city government of Baltimore. They were busy fixing other problems. They were created by foundation leaders, neighborhood leaders, and bankers who got together separate and apart from the government to say, how do we fix this? What are the tools we have? What are the philosophies we can bring? What's the energy we can bring from the neighborhood to do, to make this better? I, being a good person who learned from Jim Rouse, said you can't do any of this without a mission statement. This was the best I could do 12 years ago. And there are some key words in it. We work in strong but undervalued neighborhoods. Nobody wants to be in a bad neighborhood. They don't want your neighbor described as that, and we often describe problems more than strengths. And so we went to neighborhood leaders and said, tell us about your strengths. We believe your neighborhood is strong, okay? But we believe, as you do, that it's undervalued. If you bought a house facing Herring Run Park in 1990 for $90,000, and now it's only worth $95,000, you didn't make a good investment. You may have liked where you live, and that cut across many, many neighborhoods in Baltimore. Not just working class neighborhoods, not just row house neighborhoods, neighborhoods where there were big townhouses, neighborhoods where there were big gardens. People had made decisions to move into good neighborhoods that were strong but undervalued. Increasing home values is really important in what we do. It's a different measure. We spend a lot of time in cities talking about how many affordable units, how much poverty. What people wanted to know if their houses were more valuable as a result of our work. Not only did people want to know, but foundations and bankers wanted to know. We have a great board of bank and foundation leaders who have to show up, and they do in part because we give them numbers they understand. Is the housing in this neighborhood worth more today as a result of the work than it was 5 years ago? It's actually information that the bankers don't get from their own data collections. So increasing home values is important. We asked neighborhoods to market themselves. We discovered in Baltimore that most of the realtors selling houses in our city came from somewhere else. They were from Prince George's County or Baltimore County, and they weren't very good at identifying assets and reasons to live there. And so we set out to teach realtors and to have people market their own neighborhoods. Some of that's about the neighborliness that Paul Brophy described. Let me describe two marketing events that might get your fancy. Imagine the Calvin Rodwell School in West Baltimore, a well-performing school, but a secret. Nobody really knows it's good. Imagine a breakfast organized by 10-year-olds for realtors. Realtors came to the school and got tours and got marketed by 10-year-olds who told them how good their neighborhood and school was. Boy, that really cut it. I mean, we have a house tour of tours of Northeast Baltimore coming up Saturday. Groups of neighborhood leaders, open houses in 3 houses. There'll be about 100 people that show up. They will meet the principals of the charter, public, and Catholic schools, all of which are strong performers. None of that is pretty well known, certainly by the realtor community. And then they'll get lunch on us at a brew pub in the city. That's a different way of marketing neighborhoods and really important. The one other thing in this mission, okay? We think that people should over-improve properties. We lend money not for just code improvements. We want granite countertops. Okay? That's how you improve value. Not Formica, not the bare minimum to do affordable housing. We want people to shoot higher, to over-improve. We'll actually give them an architect to work with them to get there. Fancier kitchens. Every loan we make, and we made about 600 in our program, has to have some exterior improvements. We want neighbors to see change. Okay? It isn't good enough to paint on the inside. We'd love you to paint on the outside, plant trees, do things that neighbors see, because that creates energy. It creates the neighborliness and the connections that people want. Slide. We've reversed this presentation. We've been doing this for about 12 years, depends on whose schedule you use. And we learned some things. And Healthy Neighborhoods we've learned every year we've worked, and we've become a very strong, nimble, creative group of people. We didn't have all this in place when we started. So, we talk in Baltimore about the strengths and assets of a neighborhood. Paul listed a lot of those about Columbia, you know them all. In Baltimore, we bitch and moan about everything. If the Orioles were in the World Series tonight, we'd still complain about the relief pitching, okay? Same with the Rays, and same with our neighbors. If you complain too much about your neighborhood, people don't want to live there. And so we've set out very, very specifically to talk about strengths and assets. We've recognized that neighborhoods compete for new residents, not only with the city, but with Baltimore County, with Columbia. So what are the reasons that somebody should pick living in Baltimore and in a particular neighborhood? Is it architecture? Is it greening? Is it little leagues? Is it a good school? Is it a good private school? Is it good shopping? Is it walkability? We try and figure those out. Appreciation is a good thing. I cut my teeth at building affordable housing, and we worked as hard as we could to make sure it never appreciated. We wanted to make sure it stayed affordable. That's how the government rules are. In this case, if people are buying houses, they want to know it appreciates. When the recession hit in Baltimore, there were some neighborhoods where middle-class new homeowners handed us back the keys because they said, if my home is my best investment and it's gone down in value, I probably should get out now. And so appreciation is a good thing. It also says you want to take care of your property. Neighborhood action, community organizing, marketing, festivals, the best non-housing thing we've financed are neighborhood gardens. If you're in our city, if you're looking for a place where different kinds of people and different ages of people get together, turns out it's around community gardening. And they come and they do all sorts of great things. We need positive neighborhood action. This is a horrible story, but I'll tell it. I live in a lovely neighborhood in Baltimore, and one day when my wife was a senior health department official, one day I walked out of my house and somebody had run over a rat. This happened. Maybe it isn't a rat in Columbia, it's something else. Before I took this job and got trained by neighborhood leaders, I would have said to my wife, Barbara, please call the health department where you work and get them to come clean this up, because that's what city government should do. But I learned from my neighborhood partners that I'm responsible for what goes on in my neighborhood. So I said to my teenage daughter, shovel or plastic bag. We're going to clean this up now. And that's a very important part of what we do. We say to neighborhoods, you can't wait for the city. You've got to take this on yourself. You've got to create value. What you do, okay, will affect your house price in your neighborhood. Our programs are not income restricted. We want to say to people, if it's a good neighborhood, we want you to come, and we'll take anybody of any income because it's a good neighborhood. And we do that because most of the money we use is bank money, and it doesn't come with the same restrictions. And that was something from the beginning. Value is built by over-improving properties. We just talked about that. Granite countertops, exterior improvements, tearing down some walls, painting exteriors. Jane took us on a great tour, and we passed the Rouse's house, and Paul and I both remembered that Jim and Patty had painted their front door yellow, which violated the covenants you have about color. Boy, in Baltimore, we have the painted ladies. You drive up Calvert Street and St. Paul Street, one of the big neighborhood improvements was people getting out and painting their houses beautiful colors. It stood out as something special. I'm not suggesting you do that. That would be a horrible thing. Private capital. Private capital is just easier to use. Not to say public sector money isn't important and helpful, it's to say private capital matters. The banks we work with, and we've got about 12 of them now, and they've given us $70 million to lend on concessionary terms, which is very important. They really believe that neighborhood groups and community organizing mitigates risk. If somebody isn't making a mortgage payment, we're able to get a neighbor, usually someone from the neighborhood group, to go knock on a door and see what the problem is. Some of the hardest things are dealing with the fact you can't pay your mortgage, and how do you respond to a bank? And we've done outreach. We get people to make that call to M&T, which is managing our program, and to work out solutions. Because if you sit and wait, not much good happens. But the banks really believe that neighborhood work makes a difference. We start on the strongest blocks first. We don't go to the worst places as a strategy. We think that makes sense. And we demand measurable results. Next slide. This is how we started. Strongest blocks, viable markets but slippage, marketing and organizing, measure results. Realtors matter, they sell houses. And push up home values. Everybody's in the pushing up home values business. Next. We're in a lot of different places in Baltimore. You may know some of them, you may know none of them. Bel Air Edison has house prices that are in the $90,000 range. Patterson Park had them in the $300,000 range. But they all suffered from the same problem, which was fraying around the edges and no new homeowner markets. And it was interesting to put them all together because it's created a small social movement in Baltimore around these kinds of issues. Next. We've been in a lot of places. We've gotten to scale. We've made a big impact. We've touched a lot of houses and we've pushed up values. But we didn't start that. We've started in 3 neighborhoods, and in the first year we made 2 loans. And we just grew this over time by changing the program, adding neighborhoods, and making it fit. Next, I'm sorry. I'm going to quickly run through how we got here in Baltimore. We are a weak market city. The fundamentals don't work the way they do in Columbia today. Okay? Let's go, keep going. You can see how our population has been dropping. If there are fewer people, there are more houses. Okay? Why is that? Because we've been competing unsuccessfully with the suburbs. Next. We've lost jobs. If people don't work, they can't afford to buy houses. Next. Race is very fundamental in our neighborhoods, in the region, and we have to understand that, and it's had an impact. There are neighborhoods like Bel Air Edison that have seen every conceivable real estate scam in America. They have seen blockbusting. They have seen predatory lending. They have seen people over-mortgaging their homes. They've seen banks foreclosing and selling to investors. And yet the spirit of that neighborhood and the volume of home ownership is still there. And it was about race. There are many really worthwhile books to read about that, if that interests you. You can see the difference in incomes between the city and the region. Next. We believe in marketing a lot. We've raised a bunch of money that's been used to market. What does marketing mean to us? It means tours for homeowners. It means educating realtors. It means planting trees, fixing up parks, all those things that create energy in a neighborhood and visible change. In East Baltimore, you can get your marketing materials in Spanish, because that's a major influx. In Northwest Baltimore, we market through the Orthodox Jewish day schools because that's an important part in that neighborhood. And so there's money. This is all grant money, and we run it through our neighborhood partners. Okay. We built a loan pool because we wanted to do things the government couldn't do. We wanted to create loans that were unique to the circumstances we were trying to solve. And quite honestly, when we make presentations, it's the loan pool that interests everybody because we've raised $70 million. And it does a couple of interesting things that are based on our philosophy. It funds acquisition, rehab, refinance, rehab, or home improvements. We want everybody to fix up properties. And so if Mrs. Smith wants to borrow $10,000 to, God forbid, paint the front of her house and plant trees or fix her kitchen, we think that's a great symbol for the neighborhood and builds value just as much as somebody new buying. We lend more than the value of the house. Okay? We want people to over-improve. And so if your house is worth $100,000, we'll lend you $110,000 because we believe in pushing up neighborhood values. And we'll do it without the traditional FHA insurance. How did we do that? We went to foundations in town, Baltimore, and said, we want to be below the market by at least 2 points. And so if banks will lend us money at 1% below market, and you get at a minimum, and you provide the mortgage insurance for a portion of the loan that's bigger than the value of the house without a fee, we will save people 2%. And on a $200,000 house, that's no small thing every month. And so we went out and did that. There was a lot of goodwill at the time doing it. We have an architectural firm on retainer because rehabbing houses is really intimidating to a lot of people, whether you're doing a little kitchen improvement or landscaping. And for a couple $1,000s a month, they're available for us. They're available to help anybody that wants to think about how they can renovate their house. And they will read every contract that gets signed to make the banks comfortable that the contract reflects the work. And when there's a problem, and sometimes there is, they'll come out and help fix it. That really made the banks comfortable, there was less risk, and made people willing to take on the burden of renovation. We did get some public sector help. At one point, one of the mayors in Baltimore said, I'm a little embarrassed that you're racing ahead without me. What if I give you $10,000 to match fund your renovation? So every time a family borrows $10,000, we'll match it with a soft second mortgage. Boy, that was a market improver. So we've done all these things with loans. We're told by we run this through a bank. M&T Bank runs it for us. Their loan originator sits in our office. In everything else, you're treated like an M&T customer. And that's important. We're sending a message that these are good neighborhoods. You want to live there, you want to pick them. There's nothing that makes you a supplicant. This is about picking good neighborhoods and giving you some better tools. These are all the banks that participated, and it's important because the banks in parenthesis were the original. We've lost a lot of banks in the region, and that's had an impact. When we started our loan pool, we went to Mercantile, we went to M&T, and we went to Provident Bank, and we asked them to participate. And each of the big ones took $7 million. There was a lot of goodwill. They were feeling good about it. Right? Merck is gone. They're now PNC. There isn't the local president with a lot of authority to make that decision. Makes our work harder. M&T Bank bought Provident, and it bought Bradford. Susquehanna, so the banking environment in the region and for you has changed. And so our loan pool will probably be a little bit tougher today than it was 10 years ago. But we raised 40, and then we raised 30 more, and we're about to start raising 30 more. And they'll participate because the pool works. That from a risk point of view, it's worked. And you can see all those banks. We got guarantors from foundations in town and the Maryland Housing Fund. How many of you know there was a state FHA that guarantees loans? Back in the 70s, when FHA wasn't so good and there was lots more discrimination in banking than there is now, the state set up its own FHA, Maryland Housing Fund. It guarantees mortgages, and it still does that at scale today. And we went, and they are guaranteeing a piece of the top 10% of losses. And so if we're lending 110%, the first 10% of losses is guaranteed by the banks. Let's keep going. I'm going to too much talking. How do we know it works? Home values go up. It's not hard to find that. Tax base goes up. Houses sell more quickly. People put more money into their houses. Neighborhood groups do more. Next. One of the realtors sent this to us. This is a summary of Northeast Baltimore results where we work. And in 2017, every indicator is better than it was in 2016. Small print, you don't have to read it all. They're all up, and that's what a good neighborhood does. That's a part of that. Next. So if we knew today what we knew, it's the lament of a 60-some-year-old. What should we have looked for in Baltimore that we didn't 15 and 20 years ago? Aging homeowners, because as people age out, if enough of them age out at the same time, there's a glut of houses on the market, or their heirs get the market and rent it out, or there are fire sales and they drive down prices. Predatory lending, it is really attractive when a bank comes into a neighborhood and says, your houses went up in value, okay? Why don't we give you a teaser rate of 1% and you can take the equity out, and we'll raise it 3 years later. All of a sudden, people discover that 3 years later they have trouble making mortgage payments. And since banks have systematically done that in some neighborhoods where values have gone up and people aren't sophisticated, it's something to watch out for. Our bank's advertising unusually good rates for short periods. I don't know if you have this here, but in Baltimore, if you look at median strips, there are signs that say, "We buy houses cheap and quick." Boy, there's an indicator you want to watch out for. If people stop rehabbing, racial segregation, integrated neighborhoods are better protected from these kinds of things. Stagnant numbers, sales are flat, days on the market take longer, appreciation doesn't happen. Are other places competing better? Are there schools that are assets? If you don't have schools that are assets, it gets tougher. We had better schools in Baltimore than a lot of people knew. And once we found them, we did outreach to realtors. We also trained front desk staff in neighborhood schools to be more welcoming of parents who were thinking about schools, because sometimes they weren't. Is there a sense of community? We're discovering an interesting thing about the downtown Baltimore is really doing well. Lots of market rental housing, just as you're doing in your downtown. We're discovering that younger people, millennials who rent downtown for a couple of years, get comfortable with city living and decide they want to buy a house in the city. We didn't know that, but we're just seeing it more and more. Makes a difference. Next slide, last slide. Anyway, that's policy. Anyway, thank you for listening. This is a story you should beg, borrow, and steal from. It may not fit some of those neighborhoods, but
Mark, thank you. I just thought I'd bring it back and close with some thoughts about action steps coming from that that may be relevant to Columbia. First, who does stuff? Sometimes this slide and I will say the county, sometimes CA, sometimes it's up to kind of people in the nonprofit sector. But first, let's not lose the soul. I started with that. I want to make sure we come back to that. What are the steps necessary to do that? I don't think that's a county government function. I think that's a neighborhood function. I think whatever CA can do to help the villages and the neighbors, things like, as Mark was talking, celebrations and garden events and block parties and so on, all matter a great deal. And particularly cutting across the age groups and neighborhoods matters a lot. Secondly, maybe sometimes mediation services are necessary to resolve neighboring conflicts if they exist. I'm not just talking about kind of an issue that might exist related to somebody who's violated a covenant. Sure, that's there, and I think the village boards are there to help deal with that. But I mean neighbors who are somehow into a dispute about something that may really matter, and things begin to go sour. Well, that can really kind of fester in a neighborhood. And you've got good mediation nonprofits who can come in and kind of play a role in helping to figure things out so people get back on an even keel and can become good neighbors again. Secondly, I mentioned marketing neighborhoods. What role should CA play? What role should the county play in marketing Columbia's middle neighborhoods and other middle neighborhoods in Howard County? Those neighborhoods that maybe the market's going to overlook if left without some good marketing materials, which can be very, very helpful. Mark mentioned architectural services. I think that's really very, very important in getting these older buildings, these older homes, modernized. Outside of Baltimore, I forget what city this was, Mark, but somebody, they found a way in a neighborhood to start getting powder rooms in the first floor row house, and it really mattered in terms of marketing. What does Columbia need? And some of these older homes, you saw some of the images of, in the neighborhoods around here, how can they be improved and what kind of help? The county should target rehab resources to increase investment. I think the program you've got going is wonderful. I happen to be a proponent, I think Mark does too, of targeting. Why? Because the way the market works, if you get 20 houses that get better in a particular location, then appraisals go up and values go up in that neighborhood. And sometimes if it's scattered throughout, while you're helping people very well kind of get their houses where they ought to be, you're not getting that bounce. And so I think some consideration about targeting in middle neighborhoods might be helpful. And lastly, whether it would be useful to set up a task force to see whether there is a new county department, or perhaps a county department that takes on a new role of revitalizing the older parts of Howard County. Now, there are very old parts, like Ellicott City, obviously, but my sense is that in Columbia terms, as you said, and I agree, 50 years is not old. But this is not just now in this county about growth and about greenfield development. We're a built-out community. We're a built-out county. And do we need a kind of a county function that is more specialized related to revitalization of the older parts of the county and Columbia? So food for thought. We'll go to questions. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul and Mark. Can we give them a big hand, please?